Episode 2: Rebuilding the Kingdom. With many of the animators having left the company during the reign of the previous management team, and many of the films released during that period not meeting the level of quality expected of Disney productions, Eisner and Wells were tasked with returning the company to the stature it had fallen away from. There was only one roadblock. Eisner barely knew anything about Disney. Eisner's family didn't grow up watching Disney movies. Instead, his family spent their time watching either Broadway musicals or TV. He only saw his first Disney movie when he took his infant son, Breck, to see Pinocchio at a drive-in theater. He had never seen any of the other classic animated films and knew very little about the history of the company or the legacy of Walt Disney. Eisner himself admitted as much. Quote, "To be honest, I knew little about Disney. If Disney had not been under siege and under real risk of being acquired and sold off in pieces, I would not have passed the interview process." Once at Disney, Eisner had to do a crash course on the history of the company's founder. He quickly saw the differences in their upbringings, but at further examination, saw a similarity. Both men prided themselves in their creativity. While Eisner was certainly not the creative genius that Walt was, he had always had an interest in literature, playwriting, and scripting. Eisner often read and evaluated scripts in the departments below him, attempting to refine them. He gained a respect for Walt and his work, saying, quote, "I was awed, at a professional level, by Walt's immense creativity and originality, both as an artist and businessman stretching over a remarkable 40-year period." Despite proclaiming such respect and admiration for Walt and his work, Eisner and Wells seemingly didn't see much value in the animation division at Disney. In fact, they had quietly been planning to shut it down, until Roy asked to run the division himself. They conceded, since after all Roy was the reason both had come to Disney, but they clearly still intended to shut down animation in the future and took steps to do so. Animation, which had historically always taken place on the Burbank lot, was moved to a windowless warehouse in Glendale. When famed animator Stan Kinsey pitched a new form of technology, the Computer Animated Production System, or CAPS, as a means of elevating the possibilities of animation and streamlining the process, Wells cut him off, saying, quote, "We're gonna shut down animation. It's not making any money." It was true that animation was a mess, and losing the company money. But while Eisner and Wells saw animation as a dying branch that needed to be cut off, there was one executive that learned to value its potential: Jeffrey Katzenberg. Katzenberg had originally been the assistant to Barry Diller at Paramount, who found Katzenberg to be relentless and impossible to work with. But Eisner had taken notice of the young executive, noting his ambition and incredible work ethic. Despite Diller's warnings, Eisner took on Katzenberg as his own assistant, and while they didn't always get along, their combined work ethic yielded incredible results. Eisner had such respect for Katzenberg's abilities that he planned to immediately bring him along when he moved to Disney, and appointed him as the chairman of Walt Disney Studios, overseeing live action and animation. The first production that Katzenberg directed his attention to was The Black Cauldron, which had been in production for 10 years. The animation department was at the time divided by two generations. The second generation, who were trained by those who worked with Walt himself and worked to carry on their legacies, as well as the third generation, new animators that fought to break the mold and try something new. Many of these young animators went on to become big names in the industry, including John Lasseter and Tim Burton. But The Black Cauldron was a project heralded by the older generation and generally disliked by the younger. Oddly, despite being pushed by the older generation, who was known for trying to maintain the classic feel from old Disney movies, The Black Cauldron was actually quite a departure from the traditional Disney story, mainly due to certain scenes that were graphic, violent, and bloody. Katzenberg requested a preview of the film, and exploded upon seeing the graphic content. He demanded that it be edited dramatically, as it was far too dark for Disney to release. When the animators tried to explain that you can't edit an animated film in the same way you could a live-action film, Katzenberg scoffed, storming off to edit it himself. But before he could do anything, Eisner called him. "What are you doing? Everybody's upset," he said. Right off the bat, Katzenberg had alienated everyone in the animation department, including Roy. Although Roy also took issue with the film, having already removed some of the most graphic scenes, he didn't appreciate the manner in which Katzenberg treated his team of animators. Katzenberg, as the head of production, technically ranked above Roy, who was the head of animation. But since Roy was a massive shareholder and a board member, not to mention a Disney family member, getting on his bad side was not a smart move. While Katzenberg was busy pissing off the animators, Wells was hard at work making big changes on the executive side. Unfortunately, it is somewhat typical for a new management team to start mass firing subordinates, trading old faces for new personnel. When Eisner and Wells arrived, there was a lot of anxiety from executives that many were going to be on the chopping block. Luckily, Eisner and Wells assured everybody that their intention was not to clean out the house. Unluckily, they immediately set off to do just that. Wells began sending 2 people to do one task, judging who did it better, then firing who did it worse. He continued doing this until more than 1,000 people were fired, some of whom were replaced with Paramount executives Eisner was more familiar with. Roy was also instructed to make a list of those in the animation department that he felt should be saved from a mass layoff. Things were clearly changing, but in the meantime, Eisner became focused on an element of the company that had long been missing. From his time studying Walt, Eisner had noticed a component which had been missing from the company for quite some time: a spokesperson. Through his appearances on the Disney anthology series, later known as The Wonderful World of Disney, Walt Disney had become a figurehead in American culture. This eventually led to Walt becoming a character of his own, Uncle Walt, a calming and well-spoken persona who worked well as a spokesperson for both Walt's ideals, as well as somebody who could excite the American public for whatever project Disney was working on next. Since Walt's death, there had been nobody suited from within the company to replace America's Uncle Walt. Eisner saw this and knew that this had to change. The company sought potential candidates, people like Tom Hanks or Dick Van Dyke, but everybody was either an ill-suited fit, unavailable, or not interested. So Eisner got another idea. What if he filled the role himself? This was unpopular with his fellow executives. Eisner hardly had the charm or acting abilities of any of the previous contenders, but he was determined to make it work. Eisner lost weight, tanned, and began practicing his vocal abilities with a coach on staff. He filmed his first test screening, and he was bad at it. Some in the company sugarcoated their notes on his performance, but Katzenberg honestly told him this isn't going to work at all. Still, despite their objections, Eisner kept at it and appeared in hundreds of episodes. He never reached the levels of charisma and warmth that Walt had communicated, but over time, Eisner was able to place himself in the public's view as the leader and spokesperson of Disney. Upon the arrival of Eisner and Wells, practically every department at Disney was losing money. But there was one exception: the theme parks. Tourists and local visitors frequented the parks consistently, and yet there was more money to be made. While in power, Cardwalker had been hesitant to raise the ticket prices for the theme parks, since he believed Walt wouldn't have wanted that to change, even as inflation had changed the value of the dollar over the years. Eisner finally allowed the parks to raise their prices, and immediately, the company earned hundreds of millions of dollars in additional income. They found that the number of visitors did not decrease as the price increased. With so much money suddenly on the table, Eisner and Wells looked to create another theme park and began surveying Europe for potential locations. With a new level of success and revenue being generated from one department of the company, Eisner and the team were on the lookout for any new business ideas that the company could use to grow further. During this time, 3 ideas stood out. First, Steve Burke introduced the concept of the Disney Store, which allowed the company new outlets to merchandise their films and were very successful right out of the gate. The second idea pitched around this time was from Bill Mechanic, who pushed for Disney to release their films on VHS. Many were unsure of such an idea, as Disney had been re-releasing their films in theaters every 7 years, only to lock them back in the Disney vault. By only making their films available for a limited time on a 7-year schedule, it manufactured a sense of urgency for people to see their films again, before it was too late. As a compromise, they adopted a similar system with VHS releases, allowing customers to buy copies of the films for a limited time. This generated hundreds of millions in additional income, and any anxiety from making the films more available to the public quickly dissipated. The third idea came from Katzenberg himself. While Touchstone Pictures was the label Disney was using for adult-targeted films, multiplex theaters were beginning to pop up around the country, providing a bigger demand for new films. Katzenberg convinced Eisner to open a second adult-targeted studio called Hollywood Pictures to try to fill that gap, although Wells strongly objected to the proposal. It seemed to be a good idea though. After all, 27 of the first 33 films released under Eisner's leadership team had made a profit, so it seemed reasonable to expand production. And speaking of production, back in the live-action department, there was a new kind of film that the team had been toying around with. Who Censored Roger Rabbit was a novel set in a world where animated characters lived in real life alongside human beings. The book was risque and contained adult content, but Disney purchased the rights to adaptation anyway. There had been attempts to blend live action and animation in the past, but the results had never been seamless. Combining the mediums perfectly in a feature film would be revolutionary, and Disney was seeking to do just that. However, the project had been through a few iterations and was stuck in limbo. Katzenberg helped bring Steven Spielberg on to produce a new iteration of the film, and hired Robert Zemeckis to direct. But in giving Spielberg and Zemeckis creative control on the film, Katzenberg found it difficult to stop them from dramatically raising the cost of production. Zemeckis also insisted on hiring Richard Williams to do the animation, who refused to move to Los Angeles, forcing production to move to London. Williams mainly hired his own animators for the project, disappointing most of the Disney animators who weren't allowed to work on it. Worse, it seemed that with every day of production, they would end up being another day behind schedule, mostly due to Williams' perfectionism. When Katzenberg finally told Eisner that the budget had inflated to almost $40 million, Eisner exploded, blaming Katzenberg for not telling him sooner and ordering him to get more involved and rein in the problems. Katzenberg reduced Williams' role as manager and tried his best to prevent the press from finding out about the film's issues. Eisner also focused closer on production, bombarding Zemeckis with notes, then complaining to Katzenberg when his notes were ignored. After enough micromanagement, Katzenberg finally snapped at Eisner, saying, quote, "I'm doing the best I can. If that's not satisfactory to you, then I'm not the person to do the job." Eisner stopped speaking to Katzenberg for a period of time, the first time they'd had a true rift grow between them. But the trouble paid off in the end. Who Framed Roger Rabbit made over $350 million at the box office, and even better, helped make animation cool to teenagers once again. By 1988, Disney had become the #1 studio. This seemed unfathomable, to go from a smaller company at risk of being scrapped for parts to a massive studio that beat out the competition. Operating income had risen from $300 million to $800 million. Despite the odds, Eisner and Wells had managed to not only save the company from takeover, but lead it to massive success. And their success was only just beginning. Those Disney animators who had been left out of Roger Rabbit's production were instead put on another project, The Little Mermaid, which would be followed by a number of wildly successful animations, and kick off a period in the company's history known as the Disney Renaissance. But despite the company's unprecedented success, Katzenberg felt a sense of uneasiness. Disney was riding higher than ever before, and he felt that this momentum was impossible to maintain forever. In a New York Times interview, he voiced his concerns for the future. Quote, "We are going to run into a bad streak. We are going to fail big. Just so the scales get properly balanced, we are going to have one of the all-time big flops." Perhaps Katzenberg was right. Maybe the good times could not last forever. Perhaps trouble was on the horizon, and perhaps trouble was brewing not just for Disney, but for Katzenberg himself. Tensions were growing further and further between him and the people he worked with. The animators disliked him, Roy had little respect for him, and now Eisner was beginning to turn on Katzenberg as well. These problems would need to be addressed, but nobody could have predicted how big the problems would become. Next time, we'll follow Disney as it pushes to remain the #1 studio. While the animation division flourishes during the Disney Renaissance, tensions between Eisner and Katzenberg grow rapidly. Will their conflict ruin one of the greatest corporate comebacks in American history? Will Disney fall from grace once again? Find out next time on Kings of the Magic Kingdom.